morning, everyone. Welcome to our 2021 Virtual Elder Law Day Summer Series. My name is Christy McKenzie. I am the Assistant Coordinator of Neighborhood Services for the Department of Senior Services with Erie County. This series will take place over the next few weeks, every Tuesday and Wednesday at 10 a.m., including a variety of topics. I would like to take a minute to thank those individuals who have helped make our summer series possible again this year virtually. Our County Executive, Mark Polenkars, Karen Nicholson, the CEO for the Center for Elder Law and Justice, and our Senior Services Commissioner, David Shank. This recording will be available on YouTube at a later date. And if you have any questions today, we ask that you type them in the Q&A panel to the bottom right, and please refrain from using any personal information. I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Chris Phillips. He is a staff attorney at the Center for Elder Law and Justice, where he oversees the agency's Silver Pride Partnership, attending to civil legal needs of the aging LGBT older adults. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much, Christy, and thank you all for tuning in today for this next in the Virtual Elder Law Day Summer Series. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. As Christy mentioned, my name is Chris. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm a staff attorney at the Center for Elder Law and Justice. And today, really, I'm going to be talking to you about issues facing LGBT older adults. So, just laying the groundwork a little bit, I'm going to sort of start off by discussing some of the lived experiences of LGBT older adults. And then I'm going to try and discuss how some of these lived experiences really translate to legal issues and how service providers and attorneys in particular can attend to these issues and needs of the aging LGBT community. And then I'm really going to be discussing some tips for service providers and LGBT older adults themselves as they look for services that will be welcoming for them. If you have any questions throughout, or comments or questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put it in the Q&A. I think Christy will be monitoring that. I can attend to those at the end, or if it's something you'd like to interject at that point, Christy, you can let her know in the Q&A there. Really, before I get started, though, I just want to sort of lay some groundwork here about some baseline concepts, just so that we're on the same page. I recognize that there might be many different people listening to this presentation, whether it is service providers, allies, LGBT older adults themselves. I just want to make sure, as I use terms throughout this presentation, that we all sort of are on the same page. And I like to start that off by showing you this graphic, which I cannot take credit for. It's a wonderful graphic put together by the Trans Student Educational Resources, really to help students and younger individuals to understand concepts such as gender identity and expression and sexual orientation. But I think it really does help sort of explain these concepts if you're not really aware of them or understand them. So as you can see on the slide here, we have the gender unicorn and a number of concepts, right? So the first is gender identity. So someone's gender identity is how they perceive themselves, right? Whether that is female, a woman, male, man, right? And that's just sort of one's internal sense of what your gender is, how you feel inside. This sort of can oftentimes translate to gender expression, which is how you present that gender identity, how you show that to the world. So that could be presenting as feminine or masculine or some other combination, right? But that's really your outward appearance and how you're expressing your gender identity of how you feel inside. And of course, those two things don't have to necessarily coincide with one another, right? Another concept that, is sort of thrown around in terms of gender identity and expression and sexual orientation is your sex assigned at birth. This is really genetic, right? This is just looking to your DNA. So when an individual is born, the doctors will assign a sex at birth, whether that's male or female or intersex. Intersex is sort of where it's not immediately apparent whether to assign male or female. This is really something that you have no control over. It's really down to your genetics and your anatomy. And so that kind of will play into concepts such as transgender, which I will talk about in a minute. And then we talk about sexual orientation, right? And sexual orientation can refer to a number of different things, including whom you're physically attracted to, whom you're emotionally attracted to. So whether that's men, women, other genders, physically or emotionally, right? And so, given these concepts, there's a few additional concepts I want to bring to light as well. The first being transgender. So, you may have heard this term in the past. A transgender individual is someone whose gender identity differs substantially from their sex assigned at birth. So this is, for example, if someone is assigned female at birth, however, they feel as if their gender identity is not female, it's male perhaps. They identify as a man, right? And so there's some differing between the gender identity and sex assigned at birth. Cisgender is sort of the opposite of transgender, right? Those individuals whose gender identity, how they perceive themselves, aligns with their sex assigned at birth. So this is, for example, a male assigned at birth whose gender identity is a man, right? We use the word cisgender instead of transgender because when asked what is the opposite of transgender, we don't want to say things such as normal or things like that. So cisgender is really a term to use to describe an individual whose gender identity substantially aligns with their sex assigned at birth. Then, of course, as you can see from this graphic as well, this exists on a continuum, right? Each individual is different. So there are other sort of ways to describe gender as well, such as gender nonconforming. This is where one's gender identity does not conform to the binary male or female gender, right? There's something in between. And again, that's an individual characteristic. Other terms used to describe gender nonconforming individuals include non-binary, fluid, gender expansive. You might see a number of these terms thrown out there. And so given all of these concepts, whether it be gender identity, sexual orientation, you may see a number of acronyms thrown out there. And I just want to sort of address this at the outset. Because I will be using the term LGBT older adult a lot throughout this presentation, and I want to explain why I'm using that. So, when I say LGBT, I'm referring to to the acronym lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. You may have seen out there a lot of different acronyms, though, and I've just included some of them that you may have seen. So LGBTQ, LGBTQ+, 2S, LGBTQIA+, etc., right? So a lot of these things, 2S stands for two-spirit. The Q often stands for queer or questioning. I is intersex, A is asexual, right? So in particular for older adults, from my conversations with older adults and other practitioners in this field, we generally like to stick to the LGBT, right? Not to exclude anyone, but sometimes adding the Q for older adults can be a little disconcerting, right? Because the Q standing for queer was oftentimes used as sort of a slur, perhaps in the past, and older adults in particular may not like that term these days, or they might, right? It's hard to generalize. Recently, this term has, gained more traction and acceptance, but just to make sure that no one feels targeted, we use LGBT. Again, when I'm referring to LGBT, I'm not trying to exclude anyone. I do generally, I'm referring to sexual minorities and things like that. When I use the term older adults, other terms can be seniors, elders. Really what I'm referring to is individuals aged 50 years old and up. And I often get this look like, I'm 50, I don't consider myself an older adult, and that is true, right? Certainly. However, as we'll see, some of the lived experiences of LGBT older adults in particular, a lot of them have had hard lives, right? And so, some of their life experiences may have aged them prematurely. So a lot of the services around LGBT older adults and programs out there really do start around age 50. That's not always the case. So that's why I'm using sort of the terms, those are sort of the acronyms. Again, I hope to the listeners I'm not offending or excluding anyone, but that's sort of the reason that I like to do that. So before I sort of jump into the individual lived experiences of LGBT older adults, I'd like to start off with this just sort of framework of understanding who, generally speaking, LGBT older adults are and where they're coming from, right? So there's this sort of scheme that I like to refer to that I can't take credit for. It's a wonderful publication called The Future of LGBT plus Aging, a Blueprint for Action in Services, Policies, and Research from 2016. That really points out 3 different generations of LGBT older adults. And whenever I'm working with a client who's born in one of these generations, I like to sort of ground myself in this framework and understand what it was like for them growing up. I can't fully understand that, but I can try and place myself in their shoes and try to understand, why they're accessing services the way that they are. So the first is sort of the invisible generation, those who are born in the 1920s. So at this point, they're getting up there in age. Really, they lived through the Great Depression and World War II, where there was limited disclosure of LGBT identities. It really wasn't talked about at this point. This sort of moves into the silent generation, similar, those who are born in the 1930s and 1940s. They really came of age during the McCarthy trials, which are sort of infamously known for the Red Scare, for rooting out communists, but also had this additional lavender scare, as they called it, which really criminalized and was looking for LGBT individuals. Again, during this period, there was criminalization of same-sex relations and marriages, and this really wasn't an option for a lot of folks. And then this sort of moves into the Pride generation, those who were born in the 50s and 60s, and really on whose shoulders we stand today. They saw tremendous social change and civil rights movements, including the Stonewall riots in 1969. They saw the 1980s AIDS crisis as well, and they've lived through a lot of social change. Really, for any of these generations, a lot of the protections for LGBT individuals in general are relatively recent history, right? So in the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in the U.S. Armed Forces was not repealed until 2011. And marriage equality was not achieved in all 50 states until 2015. So that's really yesterday in terms of this, looking at the lives of these individuals. And so this maybe can account for some of the reasons why they might be hesitant to access services, or explains why they, LGBT older adults are the way that they are. So now I'm just going to sort of try and provide some perspective into some of these lived experiences, as I've mentioned, of LGBT older adults. Of course, this is, this is from conversations I've had with LGBT older adults themselves. If there are, any LGBT older adults in the audience and, you wish to share or comment on some of these, that is, welcomed and great. But really, again, we stand on the shoulders of these individuals, and so I hope I'm doing them justice when explaining sort of the lived experiences in the day-to-day that they might face. So the first is sort of unique networks of support. So a lot of us take our networks of support for granted, right? So I like to differentiate, between a family of origin and a family of choice. A family of origin is basically looking to your family tree, right? So that's going to be your family, your parents, your siblings, cousins, those who are of blood relations, so-called. And many of us, we have, complicated relationships with our family of origin or great relationships. For many LGBT older adults, however, relationships with their families of origin can be somewhat strained in some cases. For example, if your family of origin, your parents, your siblings don't understand your sexual orientation or gender identity, or they're not accepting of that. Heartbreaking and horrible. And so a lot of times, if there is this strained relationship with a family of origin, I have seen that many LGBT older adults in particular have looked for families of choice. And this is not a concept that is unique to LGBT individuals, certainly. family of choice is just, individuals whom you're not blood related to, who you want to share your lives with, right? Who you're close with. It could be close friends, other social connections. I see in my work with LGBT older adults that a lot of times families of choice are particularly strong. There's a lot of great groups in the community, and a lot of bonding over some of the experiences that I just touched on. And so, this is, great if there are unique networks of support for LGBT older adults. However, as we'll see, there might be some legal implications of this. And so it's something to just to flag for now. Sort of moving into, talking about family relationships, really LGBT older adults face unique aspects in terms of relationship recognition and marriage, and have historically faced that. So as I mentioned a few slides ago, marriage equality did not make the freedom to marry available nationwide until 2015. So until that period, there was sort of a patchwork of protections for LGBT individuals. So whether that's domestic partnerships, common law marriages, there was really, it's really important if you're speaking with an LGBT older adult to talk about relationship statuses, right? Rather than marriages, are you married? Are you divorced? To ask, what is your relationship status? Because there could be any number of things that LGBT older adults in particular entered into with their loved ones. But this means, since the freedom to marry did not become available until around 2015, many LGBT older adults still choose not to marry, just due to the sheer long-term absence of this right. And this is not something that is inherently good or bad, right? It's just an individual choice. However, it does raise some legal implications if a couple, a long-term domestic partnership, if there is no technical marriage, this can create some issues legally down the road. As it says here on the slide, domestic partnerships do not always have the same legal protections as marriages, right? So just sort of highlighting some of the protections that marriages might include and what domestic partnerships might not necessarily include for individuals. So Social Security benefits, so those who are married typically can receive sort of benefits from their spouse, including survivor benefits as well. Certain death benefits, right, may only be entitled to spouses rather than domestic partners. Inheritance rights, which I will talk about a little bit later. Certain tax benefits for married individuals, but not necessarily for domestic partners. Pension benefits, veterans benefits, perhaps immigration benefits. Some of these so-called benefits or rights are really reserved for individuals who are legally married, right, rather than in domestic partnerships. So it's important to realize that many LGBT older adults, while they choose not to marry, which is, their individual choice and totally acceptable, it does raise some of these concerns about, what's going to happen if something does happen to one of these individuals. In addition, another lived experience has historically been economic disparities. And so this is just a really jarring chart that I've taken from a publication from 2016, which really shows that, about a third of LGBT older adults live at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. As you can see, certain groups are particularly affected more than others, transgender older adults in particular. I think this is just really stark to show the economic disparities that have been faced by LGBT older adults. Again, this is a bit old, about 5 years old. So this could be, getting better. However, that is a reality that many individuals face and can really affect how they access services. And it's really a global view of the disparities. And in light of these economic disparities, there can be a host of issues that LGBT older adults face, including consumer debt issues, right? If they can't pay their credit card bill, if they don't have the income to pay their bills, they can have consumer debt issues. They can have lack of access to quality health care, especially for transgender individuals who, don't know where to go for this quality healthcare services. And social isolation is another big piece. You know, many individuals do have these strong families of choice or networks of support, but many don't, right? And so really what this equates to on a global level is a real hesitancy to access services. And that in itself can create additional issues, right? Including exploitation and elder abuse. So, you know, elder abuse and exploitation is not certainly only reserved for LGBT older adults. It is experienced, unfortunately, by many older adults in the community. However, there are some unique aspects about LGBT elder abuse in particular and exploitation that can make it perhaps a little more complicated for these LGBT older adults. The first is sort of a distrust of authorities. So many LGBT older adults might have a history of self-reliance. They're not really going to go to authorities because perhaps they haven't had, you know, great experiences with them. Perhaps that they've been arrested for who they are in the past in light of criminalization of who they were. And so they've learned to rely on themselves, and they're not going to necessarily go and tell authorities when things are going wrong. Again, increased social isolation. Social isolation is really a breeding ground for elder abuse and exploitation, because if there is isolation, there's not someone checking in on this individual and make, you know, someone to bounce ideas off of. Oh, did you get this call? Do you think that it's legitimate from the Social Security Administration, for example? You know, fears of aging alone, I think are pretty common for LGBT older adults. And this really can open up victimization for sweetheart scams. The sweetheart scam, if you've not encountered it before, is, in my opinion, the most heartbreaking thing. It's when an individual thinks that they're dating another person out there. They send them money, gifts, what have you. Turns out that individual is not actually interested in them, and it's actually victimizing them and just taking their money, essentially. Again, these fears of aging alone can perhaps make an LGBT older adult more likely to fall victim to a sweetheart scam. There's also sort of, addition, LGBT older adults might just have these feelings of this is what it means to be LGBTQ plus whatever, right? This is what it means to be me. And I just have to accept this, right? And that, of course, is horrible and not true, but that just might be an internal feeling that they have sort of experienced throughout their life, and it's hard to break at this point. In addition, particularly if there's a sweetheart scam threatening to out the older adults, right? Tell individuals about their sexual orientation or gender identity that they haven't disclosed to the world, right? And this can be particularly bad for elder abuse and exploitation, right? And can lead to additional victimization or, again, lack of accessing these services or going to authorities with this abuse or exploitation. So the last sort of lived experience of LGBT older adults that's come up in conversations with LGBT older adults themselves in my practice has been, considerations about aging, right, in general. Again, there are concerns that many individuals, LGBT older adults, will age alone. They haven't found anyone, and at this point, they're not in a position to to date or find someone. Their networks of support, in addition, might be aging alongside with them. Their families of choice, right, might be their contemporaries. They might be aging along with them. And so as they're aging, they might trust this person to act in a certain role, but it's unclear whether or not that they'll be in a position to do that as well. Additionally, long-term care options can be particularly scary, I think, for LGBT older adults. Is the assisted living or skilled nursing facility going to accept me for who I am? I think that I've heard that from quite a few individuals that they don't plan on ever going into one of these facilities because they don't know whether or not this person is going to harass them or, God forbid, abuse them for their sexual orientation or gender identity, and whether or not that facility in general is going to accept that. Again, the hope is that this is getting better, But really that is a concern for all individuals, I think, whether or not, you're going to get appropriate care at these facilities. But this added layer of sexual orientation or gender identity that has not historically been generally well accepted adds that additional layer of concern. Again, lack of access to welcoming services, whether that's at the assisted living or skilled nursing facility or whether it's home-based services as well. So in light of all of those sort of lived experiences, I'd like to sort of talk about some of that because it's some things that, it makes sense looking back, but some things that you might not have thought about if you're serving LGBT older adults or if you, know of LGBT older adults in your life. That's sort of not necessarily what they're feeling, right, but some of the things that they may face. And so now I'm just going to sort of jump into, as an attorney myself, and this is sort of my practice, some commonly occurring legal issues that are faced by LGBT older adults and what we can do as attorneys and practitioners to encourage them to address some of these disparities and get in front of them. And so the first and the main part of my practice has been advanced planning documents. So these are the common three that I refer to are the power of attorney, the healthcare proxy, and the last will and testament. Briefly about each of these documents, a power of attorney is a document which appoints a trusted agent or multiple agents to manage an individual's finances or property, right? So this can include bank accounts, entering into contracts, managing real estate, things of that nature. A healthcare proxy is a similar concept to a power of attorney, but a healthcare proxy governs medical decision-making. So healthcare proxy, an individual appoints a healthcare agent to, make medical decisions for that individual in the event that they can't, in the event that they're incapacitated. And then finally, the last will and testament is sort of a document that picks up where the other two end. The last will and testament is a document that governs the disposition of property after an individual's death. So this tells you, who you want to provide for, who's going to get all of your belongings after you pass away. And so really, a lot of times, for the last will and testament, there are sort of default structures in place. If someone passes away without a will, there's called the laws of intestate succession. And the law will select certain individuals to inherit your property. This is likely the people you would want to inherit. It's going to be your spouse, your children, parents, siblings, and so on, depending on what your family tree looks like. And so for the most part, this might be, who you want to inherit your property. However, for LGBT older adults, particularly those who have strained relationships with their families of origin, right, with their family tree, might not want that person to inherit their property, right? They might not want their sibling whom they hate and hates them to inherit this property, right? And so similarly with healthcare proxy, if there's no healthcare proxy in place, the law will select individuals, default individuals, to make medical decisions for you. And so if you don't want certain people to do that, you have to sort of elect for a healthcare proxy to appoint an agent that you actually do trust to act in this role. The power of attorney is a little bit different because there is no default structure in place, right? So really, regardless of whether or not, there is someone in your life that you would trust to do this, it's important to actually appoint an individual to manage your property, for example, in the event that you cannot do that for yourself. Again, these documents, especially for LGBT older adults in particular, it's important to draft them so that families of choice, perhaps, are given a say in a person's care or provided for under the last will and testament. If the family of choice, for example, if there's a domestic partnership, you likely will want, an individual may want to provide for that person, spending 30-something years with them, for example. If a will or something is not provided, that individual, that domestic partner, may not necessarily get anything from their partner's estate, right, if they're not legally married. So it's really important in talking with LGBT older adults, I like to really talk about these hard issues and see if there are trusted individuals again, it's difficult for those who are sort of aging alone, right? They don't have a strong network of support. But at that point, it's important to discuss options and what what they'd like to do with their estate and what they'd like to do with their life moving forward. So that's sort of the first issue, legal issue, and how, attorneys in particular can sort of advise on these issues, especially for LGBT older adults who may not have, so-called traditional family structures. The other that I've seen come up is the legal name change procedure. The legal name change process is not a particularly difficult one, but it does involve, some intervention of the court. So it involves drafting papers, petitions, and other documents, submitting it to a court, paying fees, of course. At that point, the court will make a decision, and if granted, will publish notice of the name change in a newspaper unless it's waived, and then you receive the final name change order. The legal name change process is governed by Article 6 of the New York Civil Rights Law, and it's actually important to note that changes to the law are forthcoming in December of 2021. Changes were just signed into law, I believe, in June. And so really what these changes will mean is that there might be no longer requirements to publish a name change in a newspaper. What this means is basically, as it stands now, the default in the law is that when an individual changes their name, they have to put notice in the newspaper saying, this was my former name, my dead name, and this is the name I'm assuming now. The idea behind this is that they don't want individuals sort of running from their obligations, running from creditors, right? So that there's a record out there in the newspaper. However, for transgender individuals in particular, and I have seen this in my own practice, the thought of publishing your name in a newspaper is particularly daunting, and it can be a threat to your safety, right? It can out you to the entire world that you are transgender if your name is going from stereotypically male to female or vice versa. And so that can be waived under the current law if you can show that there is some sort of risk of your personal safety being harmed. The changes to the law will eliminate this requirement, which is going to be really beneficial for transgender clients in particular. They'll no longer have to explain why they don't want this published in the newspaper. The legal name change process is something that you can certainly try and do yourself. However, it is advisable to try and work with an attorney to do this. I'll just bring up one case that I recently worked on. A 64-year-old transgender woman who is, wonderful in trying to get her name changed, right? She tried to get her name changed for the better part of 4.5 years before, connecting with my agency and my program. She encountered barriers with accessing services, getting necessary records and things like that, and she felt as though people weren't really taking her seriously. However, it was problematic because her gender marker on her driver's license had already been changed. And so, the name on her driver's license didn't match with that gender marker, and so she would sort of get these looks every time she had to present her photo ID. So after 4.5 years of trying, she was connecting with our agency, and within around 2 months of connecting with us, we were able to get the name change order. And that's nothing in particular, special about our services in particular. I think it just highlights the value of having an attorney who can navigate the courts and move things along for you. So if you'd like to connect with an attorney, I'll provide you with some resources at the end. But that's just sort of a general landscape of the legal name change scheme as it exists now. The last sort of legal issue that sort of is related to LGBT older adults in general are discrimination complaints. So those facing discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity in the areas of employment, housing, and places of public accommodation can file complaints sort of in 2 avenues, right? The first is with the New York State Division of Human Rights. This is an executive level agency that's tasked with investigating allegations of discrimination, not only on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, but also a number of other so-called protected classes. The other option is to file a claim in a state court, basically a lawsuit, right? There are benefits and drawbacks to each of these, right? The Division of Human Rights and the state's courts do each have their own processes of really investigating complaints, talking with individuals, and making a decision, coming to a decision. There are time limitations associated with filing these complaints, though. It's important to note. So for those filing a complaint with the Division of Human Rights, the complaint must be filed within 1 year of the alleged discrimination. And if filing at the state court level, it must the claim must be brought within 3 years of the alleged discrimination. It's important to note that at the outset, you really can't, you have to choose one or the other, either filing with the Division of Human Rights or with the state courts. There are options if you file initially with the Division of Human Rights. If you don't agree with the agency's determination to then bring it to a state court for further litigation. Filing with the Division of Human Rights is sort of meant to be a little easier for an individual to do without an attorney. This can be done, filed originally without an attorney. An attorney can be appointed for you through the Division of Human Rights at a hearing, if there's a hearing. Again, with the state court, it's going to be like any other lawsuit, so it might require speaking at least with an attorney to discuss the ins and outs of the court proceedings. So those are some of the commonly occurring legal issues that LGBT older adults might face day to day. So now I just sort of want to dive in a little bit to what we can do as service providers to build inclusive practices for LGBT older adults. And it's not lost on me that this audience might be diverse, right? We might have service providers, we might have LGBT older adults themselves or their loved ones. And so not only are these tips for service providers, but also for LGBT older adults who are looking for services, what they can look for to sort of recognize and identify organizations that are going to be perhaps more accepting of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So internally, there's a number of things that we sort of, recommend that service providers try to do to make it a more inclusive environment for everyone, but including LGBT older adults. This includes updating intake procedures. So this includes, identifying pronouns, asking individuals pronouns. You might have seen on my slides and in my introduction, I disclose my pronouns. It's a very easy, simple way to let individuals know that you are accepting of different gender identities and sexual orientations, right? That you're not going to assume a pronoun just because of someone's name or the way that they look or talk. Asking questions about gender identity, sort of related to that gender unicorn that I showed earlier. Asking more questions about relationship status. Are you in a committed relationship, a domestic partnership? Accounting for different family structures as well, right? So not just, do you have children? Asking more questions about who is in your life, who is important to you, because a lot of times, if you ask if someone's married, you might say no, but they might have a domestic partner for 30 plus years, for example. Obviously, non-discrimination policies are really important as well. So creating them if you don't have them, and then continuing to revise them to make sure that discrimination is not occurring internally at the workplace. Highlighting confidentiality policies as well. I think it's important as you build relationships with anyone that you're serving, in particular LGBT older adults, they know that whatever they say is going to be kept confidential. And so that they feel, ready to discuss difficult topics, perhaps such as their sexual orientation or gender identity, if that's not something that they share openly. Obviously, once you have a person's pronouns and gender identity, being respectful of that. Using the proper pronouns, right? Whether that's he, she, they, them, right? Trying to use the appropriate pronouns. If you, as a service provider or speaking with someone, use the incorrect pronouns, all you have to do is sort of apologize, you know, and then begin using those proper pronouns. If you sort of dwell on that and are overly apologetic, it can get a little awkward, right? So just really addressing it, moving on from there. And then internally as well, encouraging cultural competence trainings, we like to call them, really talking with the experts and seeing what you can do to improve the services for your that you are providing in general. So moving sort of to the external practices, and this is what sort of LGBT older adults can look for as well to pinpoint accepting and welcoming organizations. So this includes sort of rebranding external marketing materials. So that's, you know, using LGBT couples in your marketing, your pamphlets, things that you're sending out to the community, right? Showing that you're not just, you have a diverse and representative group of individuals that you are serving. Have LGBT-friendly publications and materials in common areas, right? Having pride flags, having the gender unicorn out there, right? To sort of send out little signals that you are going to be LGBT-friendly organization. I think this next one is huge, really partnering with LGBT organizations themselves. So there's a number of organizations in the community that are pride-based organizations, talking with them, right? And talking with their membership, cultivating relationships with the members, getting buy-in from them. To this end, you know, there's sort of an elder abuse summit that's held annually in the state of New York that's sponsored by the Office for Victim Services and Lifespan of Greater Rochester. And they've really started to target underserved populations in the context of elder abuse, one of which has been LGBT older adults this year. And so not only have they been, you know, talking with professionals who serve LGBT older adults, but they've also, you know, now shifted to focus groups to talking with LGBT older adults themselves, asking them questions, really getting buy-in from them and hearing from their perspective what can be done. I think it's really valuable to have those conversations and really can help service providers and the whole community in general. So now is the point in the presentation where I give the shameless plug for my agency and my program. So if you haven't ever heard of the Center for Elder Law and Justice, we're a legal services agency that's main office is located in Buffalo, New York, with satellite offices in Niagara County and Chautauqua. We serve 11 counties of Western New York, including Erie, Niagara, Orleans, Allegheny, Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, Wyoming, Genesee, and Steuben, including some additional counties served by the HELPLINE, which I will talk about. You know, income or age restrictions may apply for many services, but on the whole, these are some of the services that we do provide at Center for Elder Law and Justice, including healthcare advocacy, elder abuse prevention, consumer protection, refugee and new American services. We have a pooled trust, which if you're not aware of, is a service that really can help individuals maintain eligibility for public benefits, for example, by paying excess income into this pooled trust. We have a foreclosure prevention and housing units, income maintenance as well. These are just some of the services that are here at Center for Elder Law and Justice. And the service that I sort of oversee currently is known as the Silver Pride Partnership. It's really made possible by funding from a postgraduate fellowship through the Borchard Foundation Center on Law and Aging and additional funding from the New York Bar Foundation. Really what I try to do is, you know, address some of those commonly occurring legal issues that I've just discussed, including advanced planning documents, power of attorney, healthcare proxies and wills, name changes and gender marker changes, advising about discrimination complaints, long-term care resident advocacy if there is someone in a long-term care facility, perhaps partnering with a long-term care ombudsman program to help advocate for that individual, and then conducting legal health checkups, as we call them, to discuss whether or not there's a legal issue there. So really the eligibility for services are adults age 15 up, around 200% of the federal poverty level, and then being LGBTQ+. And another service I just want to highlight for you all on the call is our free senior legal advice helpline. This is open to any individual it needs to be New York State resident, individual, age 55 and up. Can speak with a live attorney from 9 to 11, Monday through Friday, or otherwise can leave a message that will be returned within 2 to 3 business days by a licensed attorney as well. And that helpline, again, the free legal advice helpline through the Center for Elder Law and Justice can be reached at 1-844-481-0973. Or, you can send an inquiry to via email to helpline@elderjusticeny.org. Really, what I want you all to take away from this presentation is that LGBT older adults are some of the coolest people that you'll ever meet. And so whatever we can do to empower them it is really wonderful and remarkable, and really listening to them, hearing their stories of how they've made such tremendous social change and the lives that they lived is really worthwhile. So, if you haven't had a conversation with an LGBT older adult, definitely try and do that. If you can't find them, there are plenty out there in the community, so feel free to connect with me and we can make that connection, certainly. Here's my contact information if you wanted to connect about my program or anything in this presentation. You can feel free to give me a ring at 716-853-3087 extension 283 or email me here. Also, before I leave, it's really important that we get feedback for all of these presentations that we're doing, not only for the Elder Law series, but for our agency in general. So if you're able to fill out this brief survey at elderjusticeny.org/participant-survey, in addition to the survey that will pop up that I'm sure Christy will mention. And at this point, I will turn it back over to Christy, see if there's any questions, and feel free to drop that in the chat.
Thank you, Christopher. Lots of good information. I learned a lot personally, so hopefully everyone who's joined has as well. I don't see any questions. Again, thank you. It's very informative. I'd ask everyone else on the call to actually fill out our survey as well. At the end of this session, it should pop right up. And that you join us again next week for our presentations on kinship care and Medicaid basics, including the 2021 update. Thank you. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you all so much. Have a great day.
You too.